Pippa, thank you so much for joining us here at Super Investor.
No, thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to hear your geopolitical perspectives, as always. The audience was gripped. And your view is perhaps more optimistic in a strange way than many people feel this environment is. Explain that for me.
Yeah, it's been really weird since COVID. I went into COVID in a very pessimistic frame of mind and came out saying, we're already in World War III. And to be clear, World War III is not going to be like World War I and World War II. We're not talking about the kind of ground war that we see in Ukraine, except in that one instance. But mainly, this is a technological war, and it's mainly out of public view. Well, today, most people are going, oh my gosh, we're in World War III, right? They're catching up. And I'm like, I think it's actually about to end. I think that the superpowers have been at it for so long, fighting in space, fighting in the open oceans, above and below the surface of the sea, in cyberspace, and they've just realized it's just incredibly expensive. Geopolitics has become too expensive for both the US and China. And now that Biden and Xi are meeting and the tone has changed, I think that the markets should be getting ready for a little bit of a peace dividend.
And what you've described there in terms of what the warfare looked like, modern warfare, if you like, was this battle in space, as you put it. And that's because the future is there and the resource is there and actually huge potential for this industry to invest in that space.
Well, I think of space as literally the next big frontier of the entire world economy. And fundamentally, so many of our earthbound problems can be solved with space-based solutions. Most people aren't watching it because it's not on their radar, but things like space-based solar power, which basically means cheap, clean energy from satellites in space, beaming through radio waves to get the power to any power grid anywhere. That's a game changer for clean energy on Earth. And so much so, the Saudis are backing the British to build a space-based solar power project over the North Sea because they think their hydrocarbons may not be worth as much in the future once this happens. Then also nuclear fusion is happening. That takes a little longer, but it's still coming. And so this is a revolution just in terms of power. And then add to that two other things that I talked about here at Super Investor. One was the prospect of unlimited raw materials from, I know it sounds so science fiction, but asteroid mining, which is a thing, and it is happening very rapidly. So you don't have to dig Earth up anymore to get the lithium, the cobalt, the iron ore, whatever you need. And finally, true interplanetary internet connectivity, which again, I know sounds so out there, but there's a spinoff from Google called Alria, which is already constructing this. And what that means is the value of every square inch on Earth will be lifted because you will have world-class internet anywhere, anytime. So not only can you work from anywhere, but you can monitor assets anywhere in the world and monitor Earth as a whole with much greater ease.
And even manufacturing in space, you described how pharma companies are looking there too.
It's already started. So the first in-orbit manufacturing facility went up a couple of months ago. It's primarily focused on making pharmaceuticals. People are like, wait, what, drugs in space? But yeah, and it turns out that certain ingredients in pharma won't bind in gravity, but they will in a zero gravity environment. So that's a big area, but there's lots of things. Fiber optic cables can be made with much higher efficiency. And what's really important that's coming is the production of semiconductors in space. And that, of course, again, changes geopolitics on Earth. People had been worried about conflict over Taiwan, primarily because it's the epicenter of high-end chip manufacturing, except that it isn't so much anymore. And the new chips are much bigger, and they're being made in Texas and Arizona. But the next frontier is to make these things in space with much cheaper lace lithography machines. And so suddenly semiconductors aren't in Taiwan, they're in orbit.
What do you think is the perception of all of this in this industry, and how aware are people that this is the area they need to be investing in? How surprised are you about the lack of awareness potentially?
Well, I did ask the audience, I said, how many of you guys are following this new frontier space? And I think like 2 hands went up in the whole audience. It doesn't surprise me. I'm finding this in every audience. And the reason is because The algorithms that define our news feed are literally like sheepdogs. It's like corralling us into ever narrower intellectual pens, because the way it works is it just feeds you more of what you've already looked at. So whatever you're already into, you're seeing that, but you're not seeing anything else. So if you want to widen the aperture of your view and actually see the landscape more accurately, you have to fight the algorithms. That means you have to click on stuff all the time that is outside your normal purview. And I think once you start to click on a few space stories, you're going to be overwhelmed by, oh my gosh, like a lot is happening really fast in this space. And again, it's not because I'm saying private equity needs to be invested in space. There's still very risky business models, and it's early stage tech and hard for PE. But any of the innovations from space, cheap, clean energy, cheap, clean resources, cheap, easy internet connectivity, will so profoundly affect businesses on Earth and geopolitics on Earth that I don't think you can afford to be ignorant of it.
So if you were to talk to a private equity professional who was looking, right, what should I be doing right now at this moment, what would you say their focus should be on, and what advice would you offer?
Well, I would say, look, are you in power generation in any way? If you are, you have to think through what are the implications of both Airbus and Caltech proving that space-based solar power is not hypothetical, and the prototypes are being built right now. The Saudis are backing the British to do one over the North Sea, precisely because they don't think their hydrocarbons will be worth so much in just a few years' time. So if you're doing anything in power generation, you can't afford to be ignorant of what is happening on this front. That's just one example. I do think the internet connectivity is so profoundly powerful. And that feeds into another issue for private equity, which is the PE world says we don't want to take deep tech risks, and we don't want to be in venture. We wait until companies are generating real, unimpaired cash flows. And luckily, the investors want that too now, right? The higher interest rates have meant investors are like, we're not so interested in unicorns anymore. We don't think there are many of them. We want a workhorse that generates real and unimpaired cash flow. But the thing is, the speed at which you move from one entrepreneur with an idea to a company that's acquired by a big business is much shorter. It's much faster. And so if you want to really do private equity well now, you can't assume time is on your side anymore. You have to assume the jump from tiny startup to VC to PE to acquisition is really short.
You also talked about a shift away from software, not necessarily all the way to hardware focus, but you put it somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. I've had to come up with a new word for this to just describe this new phenomena, which is shardware. And the idea is, again, everyone in this industry for 25 years has been focused on software as a service. Ever since Mark Andreessen wrote that book, that article called Software is Eating the World. And nobody wanted to touch hardware because the view was, the Chinese will do that. And anything you make that's physical, they'll just copy, and so there's no point. And as a result, the West lost its manufacturing base, not everywhere, but in large part. Today, because of the breakdown of the relationship between the US and China and the American re-emphasis on producing and manufacturing in the West, this has all changed. And so a good example of what I mean by shardware is BMW now says, look, we've got 3,000 chips in each car, and that gives us the capacity to charge to generate cash flows on something you thought you already owned. So like if you want to turn the heat on and the seat, they're going to charge you for that now. And this is a new way of thinking. So it's not hardware anymore. It's hardware with software cash flows. So we need a new category, and I think that's shardware.
So a new category, but potentially new expertise and new teams in some of these private equity companies that really need to be able to think differently?
Well, that goes without saying all the time. And one of the biggest problems we have in financial markets, and frankly in politics too, is certainty. This sense of, I already know what's going to happen. That's a killer. I've written a few books on leadership, and this is the core problem with leadership, is when people start to be overconfident about their ability to predict the future. Prediction is a terrible game, especially in a world that's moving so quickly and where most people are very specialized in silos, so they don't have an overview. A better way to go is preparedness rather than prediction. And if you're going to do preparedness, you have to be willing to consider impossible scenarios. And then some people say, well, that's a waste of time and that's just costly to spend time on that stuff. And I'm like, look at the list of things that have happened in the last 5 years alone that you would have said were impossible. We've had a pandemic. We've had a total breakdown of the relationship between the US and China. We've seen Russia threaten nuclear weapons. I mean, literally the list goes on of impossible stuff. And what I've described in space also sounds just impossible. What? Free, cheap energy from space? So I think it's worth our time to spend a little time on the preparing for the seemingly impossible, because it's the impossible that almost always happens.
Don't stick with what you know, think outside those parameters. So you talked there about preparedness. What about purpose? Should this industry have a little bit more of that?
I think your investors will require you to. There won't be, and the customers of the businesses will require it as well. This is a global trend, and it's all age groups. There are, some pockets of the world where people are resisting, for example, the green and ESG agenda. But even there, what's interesting, for example, in the United States, people who are on the hard right of politics, they care as much about the environment and its cleanliness as people on the hard left. It's like a circle. They actually come together. We're in the middle of a US presidential race, and everybody forgets that the number one political issue in America since the 1950s has been clean water. Americans are unified on we want clean water. So it's not so much a climate change. There's disagreement about climate change, lots of arguing about that. There's no disagreement about why are we destroying the environment or making the water unhealthy or creating food that's unhealthy. So I think private equity has to consider those things, because that's where your investors and your customer bases all are.
As somebody who has the amazing broad perspective you have, both geopolitically and economically, if somebody in the audience today was to take one key message from what you had to say, what would you hope it would be?
I would say the main thing is to lift your eyes above the immediate day-to-day horizon. People are so caught in the detail of what they're doing every day, they don't look up across the landscape and horizon scan. And that's my core message. Now is a really important time to widen the aperture of what you're looking at and look up to see the breadth of things that are bearing down, because that's also where all the opportunities are.
Pippa, so fascinating to hear your insights as always. Thank you so much for joining us. Great to talk to you.
Great to see you.